Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Helen Steward about her view that agency itself, not just free agency, is incompatible with determinism.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Helen Steward, a professor of philosophy of mind and action at the University of Leeds. Helen's main areas of research are the philosophy of action and free will, the philosophy of mind, and also issues in metaphysics. And she's interested not only in human agency, but as we'll talk about today, the agency of some other living things, including non-human animals, but also plants. In addition to many articles, she's the author of The Ontology of Mind, Events, Processes, and States, published by Oxford University Press in 1997. And her second book is A Metaphysics for Freedom, also published by Oxford University Press, this one in 2012. And in the second book, Helen argues for a distinctive version of incompatibilism, which she calls agency incompatibilism, which takes there to be a conflict not only between determinism and free human action, but also between determinism and the activities of a wide variety of animals. And we've asked Helen to join us today to talk about that view. So welcome to the show, Helen. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Leeds in the UK. I've been there now for 17 years. I think I'm relatively unusual amongst people who've come to work on the free will problem, in that I came to it from a different angle from the way I think most philosophers tend to get there. I think on the whole, this is a bit of maybe it's an overgeneralization, but I think it's the case that most people who are interested in free will are coming from a sort of the ethical side, possibly the religious side, but certainly the ethical side. They want to understand moral responsibility. They think free will might be a necessary condition of having any. And so that's why they want to understand free will. And that wasn't really the direction I came from. I was a philosopher of mind and philosopher of action. And I came to the free will problem really by thinking about action and how interesting action was. And by the time I'd sort of decided what I thought action might be, I thought, well, I've sort of characterized a notion of agency that would be sufficient really for what I regard as a form of freedom. And so I suppose it was having thought about the peculiarities of action and the need for really quite special metaphysics to account for action that made me think that the free will problem might have a metaphysical solution, or at least parts of it might have a metaphysical solution, as opposed to an ethical one.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've argued for a position in the free will debate that you've called agency incompatibilism. While all incompatibilists take determinism to be incompatible with free action, you take determinism to be incompatible with action in general, or just agency.
That's right.
And yeah, so part of your argument for agency incompatibilism is the premise that if there are self-moving animals, then the future is open in a sense that requires the falsity of determinism. So could you explain the idea of a self-moving animal in your sense?
Sure. So, I mean, in a way, it's a fairly straightforward idea. And probably most of the animals that might occur to you to mention in answer to the question, name some animals, they're going to be self-moving animals according to my definition. So, elephants and chimpanzees and most birds and, things like that, fish, they're going to be self-moving animals. The idea is just that of a being which, first of all, is a self, by which I mean something with a range of interesting interconnected powers, one of which is subjectivity, the possession of a kind of subjective view of reality, a point of view on reality. But another of which is the capacity to move its own body. That's what I mean by self-movement, the capacity to move one's own body. The reason why, I mean, you might just think, well, why haven't I just used the word animal rather than self-moving animal? And the reason was really because I didn't want to commit, and in a way still don't, to the thesis that everything that falls within the animal kingdom, as a biologist might conceive of it, is going to count as an agent by my lights, and is going to count as a self-moving animal by my lights. I was troubled by really, really simple creatures like paramecia, amoeba, single-celled creatures. You might think that, maybe they're part of the animal kingdom. Maybe they should count as animals. But I didn't want them to count as animals, at least not sort of by definition, because I didn't want them to count as self-moving animals. I didn't want them to count as agents, because although I'm no expert on paramecia or amoeba or similar, so I couldn't really say whether this was true, but it at least appeared that there were papers in the scientific literature which suggested that for creatures like paramecia, where they go and what they do when they get there is simply a function of various factors like pH and temperature of water and light and, those sorts of things.
Right.
So it didn't seem to me there was really any place in the explanation of the motions of a creature that moves in that way for an agent. There doesn't need to be one. It's just a cell, as it were, being pushed and pulled around by the chemistry of its environment, roughly speaking. That didn't seem to me to be sufficient to warrant the attribution of agency to something like a paramecium. So I wanted agency to kick in at least a bit higher up than that. And the question how much higher up than that is a really difficult one.
Yeah.
And I ventured some speculations in my book, A Metaphysics for Freedom, without really wanting to, commit in a very solid way to them. I went down as far as things like spiders and also worms. I had a good look at spiders and had a good look at worms. I felt really confident that spiders counted. I had a discussion, quite a big discussion in A Metaphysics for Freedom, of this account that I found in the literature of, cognitive ecology of the activities of this jumping spider. It's an Australian jumping spider. They are spiders which eat other spiders. They feed on other spiders. And there was this lovely account of this jumping spider which was trying to get another spider, the prey spider, sitting in its web. The predator spider's trying to get the prey spider to kind of come out to the side of the web so that the predator can eat the prey. And the way that they do this, it's a common thing apparently, is to mimic the struggles of a trapped insect. So, the spider's there kind of beating on the edge of the web, trying to get the prey spider to come out, tries a few times, doesn't work. And then what it does, and this is the thing that I found really amazing and really went well beyond my expectations of the sorts of things you might expect spiders to do. It goes off on a journey. It takes it at least an hour to do this journey, and it goes well out of sight of the web in order to do it. It reappears on this rock projection above the web where its prey spider is sitting, swings itself down on a thread, swings into the web and grabs the spider. So that seems to be I found that extraordinary, partly because it has to go out of sight of the prey spider to do it. It has to, as it were, retain a plan. It has to form a plan.
Hmm.
It has to have that kind of appreciation of its the spatial affordances of the
Hmm.
environment it's in, to be able to put together a strategy for
Mhm.
getting to this spider in a different way from the way that it's tried. And these are rather sophisticated abilities, it seems to me. So I wanted spiders to count. Worms were a bit less clear. Um, Darwin, I don't know whether you know, Darwin had I don't know what you call them. They're called wormariums. Maybe they're something like that. I don't know, but he had one anyway in his
Okay.
office, um, and studied them in great detail. And one of the things that he points out, that is quite striking and that most people don't know, is that worms live in burrows. They make burrows and they line them with leaves. They have little homes, and these these facts are not known, or weren't known to me anyway, prior to having read these bits of Darwin. And Darwin, one of the observations Darwin makes is that worms are able to draw the bits of leaf into their burrow by the most sensible end. So you draw it in by a pointed end, not the broad end,
Mhm.
to get it to come in properly. Um, that's quite impressive. Whether those sorts of things are really enough to constitute the capacity for agency, I'm not sure. I think there are places where our intuitions are going to give out, and where the answers are not going to be definite. I mean, the way I conceive of it, agency isn't like, it's not an all or nothing thing. It's developmentally and evolutionarily. It's a gradually emergent power.
Hmm.
Um, but it does seem to me that many animals have it. Yeah.
Hmm. Well, speaking of your conception of agency, on your conception of agency, actions are essentially up to the agents that perform them. Could you say a bit more about what it means for an action to be up to an agent? Perhaps how this is related to the notion of settling whether something occurs?
Sure. I mean, I think the notion of up to that I'm using there in many ways is just the everyday one.
Hmm.
It's the ordinary one. Some things are up to me. Some things aren't. Some things I can't do anything about.
Hmm.
But actions are the quintessential things which are up to me. Because they are things I have to execute if they're going to occur at all. I've got to be in this executive relation to the world, in particular, usually an executive relation to my body, the bit of the world that is my body,
Hmm.
in order to make an action happen. By the way, I think that's true even in the case of so-called mental actions, because mental actions are also bodily.
Hmm.
They go on somewhere in us. We may not be able to say exactly where. They may not even be intelligible to give them a precise location. Nevertheless, they depend on events which are taking place in our body, and so it has to be us that does something to our body in
Hmm.
bringing them about. Well, at least that's the way I like to think of it. So the idea that I wanted to insist upon, I suppose, is that um, actions are these sort of places in the world where we have the opportunity to do something or not do it. Um, and whichever of those two things we light upon, whichever of those two things actually happens, um, we have effected a settling of something. The world has gone one way, as I often put it, when it could have gone another. And I see to it that the world goes that way rather than the other. Whether I do nothing or do something, I am seeing to it that the world evolves in one way when there was a possibility for it to go at least one other way, or perhaps myriad possible ways, I make it the case that one of these futures, as it were, is forged from the range of possibilities that are available. So that's the notion that I called settling. And when we settle something, the thing that we have settled to be one way rather than another will be something that has been up to us. So that's how those two notions of up to usness and settling are related. I mean, in a way, all I'm doing is, I think, requisitioning very ordinary
Right.
ideas that we use a lot for my own theoretical purposes. I don't really think I mean anything all that different from what anyone would mean by saying that something was up to them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So we've already talked about the idea of a self-moving animal. And one interesting feature of your work is the focus on animal agency in general and not just the agency of human animals. And you've already mentioned that you think that spiders count and maybe worms. We're not sure about those. So, how is your conception of agency an outgrowth of the concept of animacy?
Yeah, so maybe it'll help if I say a little bit about why it seemed to me so important to think about non-human animals when thinking about the free will problem. Um, I mean, I think traditionally the free will problem has just always been taken to be a problem that's specific to human beings. It's about us. It's about moral responsibility. So, of course, it's only about us, because it's usually supposed that no other animals can have moral responsibility. And I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think there are interesting questions to ask about animals and morality, but probably I think I would in the end agree that animals don't have moral responsibility. So why did it seem so important to think about them anyway? Well, the reason was really when I thought about the world as characterized by the determinist, it seemed to me it wasn't just the existence of human beings and their modes of functioning and kinds of agency that seemed to be in tension with that deterministic vision. But animal activity in general, animals, it seemed to me, do stuff that's up to them. They move about, they move here, they move there. It didn't seem plausible to me that their actions were determined any more than that ours were. And that's what really made me start thinking about agency in general and what it might be. I started to think about animality in general and what that might be.
Hmm.
And I guess I became attracted to what you might think of as a sort of layered view of animals. I mean, I think the picture which encourages to think deterministically both about, or at least one picture which encourages us to think deterministically both about ourselves and about other animals, is a sort of reductive picture which thinks of all material beings as sort of composed out of more basic entities, small particles of some kind or another, whose interactions are the basis of everything else. And of course, to some extent, I just regard myself as a naturalist. I'm as opposed to many, compatibilists are, to kind of very non-naturalistic ways of thinking about free will. I want my account to be naturalistic,
Hmm.
but I suppose what I wanted to suggest was that by thinking harder about the science of biology, I mean, I think the science that philosophers always have in mind is physics. They're always interested in, well, what does physics say? What does physics
Right.
say? But it just seemed to me there's like this big intermediate science of life that just isn't coming into focus here in the free will debate. And surely what we are if we're looking at ourselves naturalistically, is a kind of animal. What we need to understand is how animals work. And yes, although, of course, animals are made up of smaller things, those smaller things are organised into, for example, cells, the building blocks of life. And the cells are organised into tissues. The tissues are organised into organs, and the organs are organised into subsystems. You have this sort of layered approach to the animal. And each level, as it were, has a certain sort of government of the ones below it. So what happens to, for example, the tissues in an organ are going to be partly determined by the organ, right? And it's the organ's needs. The organ is going to direct things here and there within the organism in order to, to downwardly affect the tissues, for example. So you have this phenomenon that many philosophers have been interested in called top-down causation, and I wanted to explore whether that might be a way of coming to think about agency, because it did seem to me that agency was really a variety of top-down causation. It's the causation of smaller events in my body and its subsystems by me, the big thing. So top down in that sense, from big to small, from whole to part. Wholes, I wanted to say, can affect their parts. And that's what we have in animality, wholes affecting their parts. And in general, larger, as it were, parts affecting smaller parts. That's characteristic of biology. It's actually not foreign to physics either, but it's particularly obvious, I think, in biology. So what I wanted to say is that we can think about agency as it were, the functioning of the top level of the whole system. The whole animal is having effect on its parts when we act. So that's the sense in which my conception of agency comes out of my conception of what animals are and how animals in general are structured and how they work.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That description of the top-down view makes your view sound a bit like a kind of agent causationism that we've talked about on this podcast before. Near the beginning of our show, we talked with Tim O'Connor about his kind of agent causal picture. I'm curious, in what ways is your view an instance of agent causationism, and how might it differ from other kinds of agent causationist views?
Yeah, that's a tricky question because there are so many different agent causationist views. I think one problem I have with just saying that I'm an agent causationist is it is a result of the way agent causationism is usually defined. Agent causationism is usually said to be the view that agents cause their actions.
Right.
And I think that's false. I don't think they cause our actions. I think our actions are our causings of other things. And I think that really matters. It really, really matters. Some people seem not to think it matters very much at all, quite how we put it. But I think it really matters because if you say that we cause our actions, you've got to answer the question, well, how do we do that then?
Right.
And the only intelligible answer would seem to be by acting.
Yeah.
Right? We cause them by acting. And then you've got to regress. You've got the requirement for every action to be caused by another, which brings it into being, and that's hopeless. That was one branch of the regress that Donald Davidson famously noted about the problem about agent causation. So you shouldn't say that agents cause their actions. And I think, incidentally, Tim O'Connor doesn't say that. He also has a different formulation which doesn't involve that claim. But I certainly do have a lot in common with many of the claims agent causationists have typically wanted to make. And in particular, I want to try to reclaim, as many other agent causationists do too, reclaim a place in the sort of, in our understanding of the machinations of the world for things, particularly animals, because animals are things in a really good, strong sense. I mean, Aristotle called them primary substances for a good reason, because they're the best. They're the best examples of things whose functioning isn't really understandable independently of a sort of holistic view of the whole system is making things happen as a whole. So then they're non-reducible to their parts in a very strong sense, and that makes them very good examples of substances. So like many other agent causationists, I want to insist on the importance of the substance, of the thing, in our understanding of what happens. When we do things, it really is something that requires our existence as a properly integrated, organized entity. And the other thing, I suppose, is that I'm very anxious to get away from the idea that absolutely everything that happens is caused by constellations of events. That seems wrong to me. That's not the case. And in the case of action, it's definitely not the case. That's not what an action is. Actions have to be caused by different kinds of things altogether. Wanted to get away from the sort of event causation picture of the universe.
Yeah. Your claim is that agency requires that actions be up to their agents, and that this is incompatible with determinism. It sounds like this is related to Peter Van Inwagen's consequence argument, but in your book, you say that you take the argument to be inconclusive. Could you say a little bit about why you take the consequence argument to be inconclusive, and how you take your argument for agency incompatibilism to do better than the consequence argument?
Yeah, I mean, I should say, I guess, first of all, that I love the consequence argument. I think it's a great argument.
Nice.
So it's not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with it. Really, I'm convinced by it. I think it's a really good argument in many ways, and like many other libertarians, I've been very heavily influenced by it. In saying that I thought it was inconclusive, I think the point I was really making is that the free will problem is not the kind of debate that's going to be settled by a formal argument. I mean, Van Inwagen very impressively and very carefully tries to formalize his argument as far as it can be formalized, and moreover does it in several different ways, right? There are several different formal versions of the consequence argument. But you can always pick holes in a formal argument. The thing that compatibilists have tended to go for is the move that people call, the rule, the inference rule that people call rule beta. In the original formulation of the argument, so rule beta says that if no one has any choice about P, and no one has any choice about whether P entails Q, then no one has any choice either about whether Q. So that's rule beta. But the compatibilists are very likely to want to deny that, because they are going to want to say, no, it can be true that I don't have any choice about the way the distant past is. I don't have any choice about the way the laws of nature are. But I do have a choice about what I'm going to have for tea. It just doesn't follow. They are going to say, and they have very ingeniously made their own explanations and arguments about why it might not follow. People like Michael Sloat and Mackay and Johnson have alleged counterexamples to that inference principle from other areas of philosophy. So Well, I think all I meant to say was no one's ever going to agree that a formal argument clinches it. It's going to be, as philosophy always is, really, it's a matter of people offering one another overall plausible packages of ideas, views, visions, and saying, well, how about if we thought of it like this? Might not this be a better way of thinking about it than, maybe like this? And yeah, so I think all I was really trying to say was that I didn't think a formal argument was ever going to be the clincher. It's not.
Mhm.
It's not, because you can always find some principle or rule to derive from. My argument, in some ways, I think I take to be quite closely related in some respects to Van Inwagen's. It is quite like his in certain ways, in that I do think it's important for. I mean, Van Inwagen uses the notion of up to me.
Right.
Things have to be up to me. I use it too, but it's slightly different from Van Inwagen's arguments in that Van Inwagen, in the way that he puts things, seems to imply that he thinks there could be actions that weren't up to me, things that were absolutely my actions but still not up to me. That, for me, is a contradiction. If it's not up to me, it ain't an action. It's something else. Actions have to be up to me. It seems to me that's a conceptual truth about what they are. They have to be things such that it's up to me at their point of origin whether they, as it were, arrive in the world or not, whether they are, as it were, created or not. It's my executive power or my refraining from executing my executive power that makes them be or not. And if that's not the case, then they're not actions, they're something else.
Yeah.
Well, the classic challenge for any form of libertarianism about free will is the problem of luck, or the problem of chance, as it's sometimes called. Could you explain how you respond to the challenge that undetermined actions are too much a matter of luck to count as free?
Yeah. I mean, there are many strands to my answer to this question because it's a tremendously complicated matter. It's a tremendously complicated matter to solve the problem of luck with many strands. But just roughly and quickly, what I take to be the nub of the answer is to get away from thinking of agency as a matter essentially of events and states that are linked together in causal chains. That's what gives you this picture of the universe as working by way of the occurrence or not of a particular event. So if the event is either explained by its precursors, in which case you've got, if it's properly explained, fully explained by its precursors, then we've effectively got a deterministic nexus. And if it isn't, we've got some chanciness. Things just went one way rather than the other. It's that that choice is forced on us if we are event causationist about things.
Right.
And you are stuck. You are stuck with the problem of luck if that's the way you think about things, or so it seems to me. You've got this determined or random choice, and neither of those is any good for understanding agency, or so I think. What you have to do instead is move away from that ontology to an ontology, a substance ontology of agents with powers, and in particular, agents with what I call two-way powers. That's to say, powers which cannot be possessed independently of the power also to refrain from exercising them. So I can't have the power to swim, for example, to take a particular type of action, unless I have the power to refrain from engaging in swimming. They go together like that, active powers with powers of refrainment. So that's what I want to say. And it's that notion of a two-way power which ultimately, in my view, ends up holding the key to the solution to the problem of luck, because it enables something to come from me, right? It's because it's me who's the agent, so I'm producing something, and in producing it and being an agent, being active, while at the same time necessarily possessing, in virtue of my possession of the power of agency, the power at the same time to have refrained. So you have to, you really have to recast the whole way that you think about agency in order to avail yourself of that solution. If you're thinking in terms of events and nexuses, which are just characterized by the occurrence of something either determined or random, you've just had it, I think.
Yeah.
It has to be a wholly different kind of ontology in order to make sense of a solution to the challenge from chance, as I call it in my book. But there are many other intertwined issues. There are issues which have to do with how reasons explain. No, those issues are very important. They require treatment as well. But it will probably take me longer than we've got to explain the whole of my view about how one would need to respond to the challenge from chance. But yeah, there are many strands, but the crucial one, I think, is to change your ontology. You've got to have substances with powers, or you've had it.
Yeah. So your view is a leeway view, and it's leeway about agency and not just free agency. One challenge from the sourcehood camp are the so-called Frankfurt cases, which attempt to show that leeway is not required for moral responsibility. How do you respond to Frankfurt cases?
Yeah, it's interesting you say mine is a leeway view. I mean, in a way it is, of course, but it's also a source view. Indeed, I've argued that the two things are two sides of the same coin, if you understand them both aright.
Yeah.
That leeway demands sourcehood and sourcehood demands leeway. You can't really be a source unless you've got this two-way power of agency that I keep banging on about. They go together, I think, leeway and source. But coming back to the idea of a Frankfurt case, yeah. So maybe just to get clear, it would be good to have a particular example of a Frankfurt case in mind. So we can let's just take the sort of standard one where, so I've got to vote, and Black, who's this nefarious neurosurgeon who's waiting in the wings, is watching my every move. He's able to scan my brain and see what's going on in there. And he wants me to vote for candidate X. So if I'm showing any signs of voting for candidate Y, then he's going to intervene and make me vote for candidate X. Okay, so let's just get that straight. Okay, so what I want to say about that situation is we're supposed to think that I haven't got any choice. There's no leeway, because either I vote for candidate X of my own free will, as it were, or in the counterfactual situation in which I start in some way to try to vote for candidate Y, Black's going to make me vote for X in any case. But that, for me, is an incoherent description of what's going on. If it's Black who's the source, if it's Black who's the source of this causal chain, what reason have we got in the counterfactual situation to say it's my action? It isn't. It isn't my action. It isn't my decision. It's some event that's going on in my head, but Black has produced it. And so it's Black's action. It's not mine. That's my fundamental quarrel with the way the Frankfurt cases are set up, is that it's just not true that I couldn't have done otherwise. I could. what I would have done is refrained, right? I would not have acted. Then Black would have leapt in, but what then occurs would not have been me acting. That would have been Black acting. So that's my simple response to, and it's the same as I think Maria Alvarez has argued the same thing. That's I think the way to answer the Frankfurt problem.
Yeah, nice.
Well, thanks so much, Helen. This has been awesome. It's been great to hear all about your view and then press you on all these different areas of the free will debate. If listeners want to read some of your work or follow what you're working on now, where can they go to follow what you're working on?
I'm afraid I'm really terrible about this kind of thing. I'm really bad at kind of curating my own work. I don't even have my own personal website. I mean, I do, but it's the University of Leeds' website.
Right.
My things are always available through that. They're in the White Rose repository that Leeds has. I tend to put them on academia.edu as well. So one way or another, you'll be able to find my stuff. But I'm afraid I have to apologise for having always been awful organising this in a nice way for people.
Yeah, thanks again, Helen.
You're very welcome. Thank you for giving me the chance to come on your show and have a chat.
You're welcome. Our next episode will focus on free will and the paradox of moral education, and our guest will be Sabrina Little, assistant professor at Christopher Newport University.